There's a moment, and it lasts less than 3 seconds, where Jonathan Anderson, the creative director of one of the most powerful fashion houses on the planet, stops mid-sentence. Not because something went wrong, not because he was distracted. He stops because Jimin walked into the room. And what happened in the next few seconds, the expression on Anderson's face, the way his eyes tracked, the specific words he chose, was caught on camera, shared, replayed, and then studied frame by hundreds of thousands of people who all came to the same conclusion. This wasn't a PR moment. This wasn't rehearsed. And the fact that it happened in front of the entire fashion world made it impossible to ignore. This channel exists for the army who watches things twice, the ones who notice what's happening slightly off-center, in the background, in the 2 seconds before or after the moment that everyone else is already screenshotting. If that's you, you're going to want to stay until the very end of this video, because what most coverage focused on was the surface, the outfit, the hashtags, the follower count. What we're going to talk about is something smaller, and something that, once you see it, you won't be able to unsee. June 24th, 2026, Paris. Paris Fashion Week Men's, the twice-yearly event where the fashion industry essentially holds its breath and waits to see which creative director is going to redefine what menswear means for the next season. On this particular morning, the venue was the Musée Nissim de Camondo, a historic mansion in the 8th arrondissement, the kind of building that feels like it was designed specifically to make whatever happens inside it feel important. Jonathan Anderson, newly appointed creative director of Dior Men, was presenting his first major menswear collection. The pressure in the room was significant. Fashion critics, buyers, editors, cameras from every major outlet. The collection, which blended structured tailoring with a kind of intellectual looseness, houndtooth patterns reworked into prints, polka dots dissolving into sequin motifs pulled from a 1979 Dior archive, was already generating pre-show buzz. And then, Jimin arrived. He came out of a black luxury car, dark blue embroidered velvet jacket, ornate gold-toned patterns, green checkered shirt underneath, light blonde hair shoulder length, a small pendant necklace catching the light. The crowd outside, fans who had been waiting for hours in the June heat, erupted. But it was what happened inside the venue that no one expected. Jonathan Anderson, standing near the entrance to the show space, was mid-conversation when Jimin walked in, and the footage, shared initially by fashion press cameras, then immediately picked up by fan accounts, captured the exact moment Anderson's attention shifted. He looked at Jimin, and then he said something. 2 words, maybe 3, short, spontaneous, the phrase that has been translated across approximately 40 different languages in the past 72 hours, shared by fans who don't even follow fashion, shared by accounts that have never posted about K-pop before. Wow, amazing, wow. That was it, said directly to Jimin, not to a journalist, not into a microphone, just to him. And Jimin, for his part, smiled, the specific kind of smile, the one where his eyes do most of the work. Here is where it gets interesting, because the clip spread fast. Within the first hour of Jimin's arrival at the Dior show, there were already more than 250,000 posts on X alone. By the end of the day, that number had crossed 550,000. But what made it spread specifically wasn't the number. Numbers are abstract. What made it spread was a specific zoomed-in version of the clip that started circulating about 4 hours after the original. In this version, you can see something that's easy to miss at normal speed. Before Anderson says anything, there's a pause, brief, maybe a second and a half. He sees Jimin, full look, full entrance, and in that pause, his expression does something that fashion people would call extremely unusual for someone in his position. Jonathan Anderson is not someone who typically performs emotion for cameras. He's known in the industry for being cerebral, reserved. His interviews are careful. His public reactions are measured. He spent years as the creative director of Loewe before taking on Dior Men. He has been surrounded by extraordinary aesthetics for his entire professional life. And yet, in that second and a half, before he said a single word, his face did something entirely unguarded. Fans described it in hundreds of different ways in hundreds of different languages. But the most common description, the one that kept appearing in thread after thread, he looked genuinely surprised. Not at Jimin's presence, everyone knew Jimin was coming. Surprised at something else, something more difficult to name. This is the part that separates this moment from other red carpet moments that trend for a few hours and disappear. The clip didn't stay inside K-pop spaces. By midday Paris time, it had appeared on fashion industry accounts, style journalists, aesthetic pages with no K-pop content whatsoever. And the comments on those posts, from people who may have known very little about Jimin or BTS or what either of them meant to the last decade of popular culture, were saying a version of the same thing. Who is this person? The way the room shifted when he walked in. The director's face, though. There's a particular kind of virality that happens when someone crosses over from their own world into a completely different one, and the people in that world react the same way everyone else always has. It's the virality of proof, of validation from a source that has no particular reason to give it. Jonathan Anderson is not an army. Jonathan Anderson is not in the business of being kind to celebrities for the sake of it. He is, by every account, someone whose entire professional existence is built around an extremely refined, extremely specific sense of what constitutes beauty and craft. And he saw Jimin walk into a room and said, "Wow," twice. That's the thing that made the clip travel. Several fan accounts, including at least two with backgrounds in fashion or visual arts, posted frame-by-frame breakdowns of the interaction. What they were looking at specifically was not what Anderson said, but how he moved. A few things stood out. First, Anderson's posture shifts before he speaks. His body turns slightly, not dramatically, towards Jimin. This is a movement that happens almost automatically in humans when something captures genuine attention. It's not a polite turn, it's an instinctive one. Second, his hands, which had been gesturing mid-conversation, stop moving completely, for the derision of the moment. This is subtle, but it's the kind of detail that body language analysts point to as an indicator of full, undivided focus, the kind that happens when someone's conscious mind has briefly taken over from the social autopilot. And third, and this is the detail that seemed to hit people the hardest, the moment he finishes speaking and Jimin smiles, his expression changes again. Not dramatically. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be legible. There's something in his face that lands somewhere between satisfaction and what can only be described as quiet recognition, like someone who has spent his career looking for a certain quality in things, and suddenly, unexpectedly, found it standing right in front of them. And this is where it starts to feel like something larger. Because this is not the first time the fashion world has had this reaction to Jimin. In 2023, when Jimin first became global ambassador for Dior, the announcement generated a volume of engagement that the brand called unprecedented for a fashion house announcement. At the time, some industry observers were cautious, attributing the reaction to fandom, to social media mechanics, to the specific gravity of BTS as a cultural phenomenon. 3 years later, something has shifted in how those same observers talk about it. The conversations happening on fashion industry threads and style publications this week are not primarily about the fandom, they are about Jimin specifically. About his aesthetic sensibility, about the way he moves through a room, about what exactly it is about him that generates this particular quality of attention. One fashion journalist, writing on X without tagging any K-pop accounts, clearly not writing for that audience, used a phrase that ended up quoted in at least a dozen ARMY threads. Jimin has the kind of presence that fashion is always trying to dress. He makes the clothes feel chosen, not worn. That sentence was written by someone who, by every indication, came to the Dior show as a fashion person, not a music fan. And it said something that a lot of ARMY have been trying to articulate for a long time. And here's the part that most coverage didn't pause on. Because the interaction with Jonathan Anderson, as significant as it was not actually the thing that made the most ARMY stop scrolling. There was something else. Something that happened slightly later in the morning. Something much quieter. and it involved a conversation between Jimin and someone from the fashion house who had seen him up close many times before. Olivier Villalobos, Dior's chief communication and image officer and deputy managing director, a man who has been at the center of Dior's global communications for years, someone who has worked alongside some of the most photographed people in the world. He and Jimin were photographed sharing a hug. That detail on its own is not unusual. These events involve a lot of contact, a lot of warmth performed at scale. But what got attention was the timing. This wasn't an entrance hug. It wasn't a goodbye. It happened in the middle of the event, a quiet moment, slightly away from the main camera positions, captured incidentally by a fashion photographer who was focused on something else entirely. And in that moment, Jimin's posture is completely relaxed. There is something ARMY have talked about for a long time, the difference between Jimin's public-facing warmth and his private warmth. The first is extraordinary by any measure, but the second is quieter, more specific. It shows up in his shoulders, in the angle of his head, in the way his hands move or don't move. In this photo, he looks entirely at ease. In a room full of industry executives, critics, cameras, and the specific social weight that Fashion Week carries, he looks like someone who simply belongs there. Not because he performed belonging, but because he felt it. Here is the thing that makes this moment feel like more than a Fashion Week appearance. Jimin has been a Dior ambassador since 2023. This is not his first Paris show. It's not his first time in this world. He's attended major fashion events, been photographed in Dior for campaigns, been in rooms with people whose entire careers are built around beauty and image. And yet, every time, without exception, the room reacts the same way. Not because he's famous. Plenty of famous people attend these events, and the room does not stop for them the way it does for him. Not because he's beautiful. That is by this point almost beside the point, or more accurately, it is only the surface of the point. The rooms react to Jimin the way they do because of something that is genuinely difficult to manufacture, genuinely difficult to train, and genuinely difficult to describe in language that immediately starts to sound like hyperbole. He is fully present. In an industry, in a world where the currency is image, where the performance of image is constant and exhausting, and often completely disconnected from whatever is actually happening inside a person, Jimin somehow manages to be exactly where he is, every time, completely. Jonathan Anderson has spent his career in rooms full of people performing presence. He knows the difference between someone inhabiting a space and someone performing inhabitation. And when Jimin walked into that room on June 24th in Paris, he didn't have to say anything. He didn't have to gesture. He didn't have to turn on something. He just walked in. And Anderson said, "Wow," twice.
But there's one more piece to this. Something that almost nobody reported on, because it happened not at the show itself, but in the hours afterward, on a platform where millions of fans go to process exactly this kind of moment. And what Jimin posted, what he chose to share, and when he chose to share it, and the specific details he included, added something to the narrative that even the most thorough fashion press didn't catch. After the Dior show, after the photographers and the handshakes and the crowd of fans outside who had waited for hours in the Paris heat to catch a glimpse of him, Jimin posted a photo on Instagram. It was not a photo from the show, not a professional shot, not the kind of image that gets pre-approved and styled and released with a caption team behind it. It was a single image, shot from inside a car, the Paris cityscape blurred through the window, and in the reflection of the glass, faintly, barely perceptible, his own face, looking out. The caption was 3 words: "Merci Paris." That was it. No brand mention, no formal hashtag, no elaborate reflection on the day. Just 3 words in French to the city that had just watched the creative director of one of its most iconic houses stop mid-sentence to say that he was amazing. An army who have spent years learning to read the space between what Jimin says and what he means understood something in those 3 words that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. He was moved, not by the cameras, not by the attendance or the hashtags or the 550,000 posts, by something quieter, by the experience of being in a room where people who knew nothing about Busan, nothing about the years of training, nothing about everything it took to become who he is, looked at him and felt something real. There's a particular kind of validation that cannot come from people who already love you. It has to come from someone who has no reason to, someone who is not ARMY, someone who is not a fan, someone who meets you as a stranger in a room that belongs to their world, not yours. On June 24th in Paris, Jonathan Anderson, one of the most respected creative minds in contemporary fashion, met Jimin as a stranger and couldn't hide what he saw. That is what the photo in the car was about. That is what the 3 words in French were saying. And that is why hundreds of thousands of people, ARMY and non-ARMY alike, sat with that post for a moment longer than they usually sit with anything else. There's a version of this story where we analyze it until it loses its shape, where we turn a genuine human moment into a content format, run it through the machine, extract every frame of meaning until there's nothing left that feels real. We're not going to do that, because what happened on June 24th in Paris doesn't need explaining, it needs witnessing. Jonathan Anderson looked at Jimin and said what he saw. Jimin sat in a car afterward and felt what the day had been. And somewhere between those 2 moments, in the space between being seen by a stranger and choosing to process it quietly, privately, with 3 words in someone else's language, there's something about Jimin that has always been true and that this particular Tuesday in Paris made impossible to ignore. He is not performing anything. He never has been. And maybe that's the detail that fans have always known, and that the fashion world, slowly, undeniably, is starting to understand. So here's the question worth sitting with, not for a comment section, but for the next time you watch any clip from this week in Paris. What do you think it is, specifically, that makes a room full of people who have seen everything still stop when Jimin walks in? Because the answer might be simpler than we think, and more complicated than we're ready for. If you've been carrying a theory about this for a while, one you haven't seen anybody else put into words, this is the place for it. The most interesting things said about this moment haven't come from journalists, they've come from people who've been paying attention for years.